Hey everyone, Taylor Torrance here from Cosmic. Today we're going to jump into some super audio nerd stuff. We're going to talk about applying limiting to your master channel. I want to give you all basically a guide, a roadmap for how to approach that limiting process in your mastering. Of course, there's a lot that goes into mastering to get a track loud but yet still dynamic and not distorted but still have impact, and limiting is a very essential step in that process. It should go last on your chain, and it's really the most important step in getting loudness out of your track. And so it's very important to be able to work your way around a limiter. I want to show you all what to listen for, what some of the advanced features are, and what they do within limiters. But before we jump in to FL Studio and listen to the audio example that I have queued up right now, I want to say why this is important, because I can imagine some of you thinking, but I don't master my own music. A couple things to say about that. I would encourage you to get to a point where you are able to at least put a light mastering chain on your own tunes and at least work your way around or know your way around a couple of the quintessential processes that go into mastering for a couple of reasons. First, it's very expensive for every release to pay $50 or $100 for someone else to master your music. And if you're releasing enough, if you're releasing as much as we all should be striving to release, that's going to rack up, it's going to get expensive really quickly. Second of all, no one is going to care about the quality of your master as much as you are. You can pay some of the world's best mixing and mastering engineers. They're still not going to care as much about the final product as you are. And so when you do your own masters, you're probably going to be the best person to give it the most love and attention and get the best result. So you should match that level of care with that level of knowledge. That's just my opinion. I think you guys can resonate with that as well. And also, every time you send a demo to a record label, it could get, we talk about it getting expensive, paying someone else to master all of your releases. Think about how expensive it can get paying someone else to master all of your demos. Now, I'm not saying that every demo you send to a label should be fully mastered. I'm saying you should at least apply some basic processing on your master channel. Nothing that's going to color the sound too much, but some processing that's going to give it a little bit more impact, a little bit more loudness, so that the label, when you send them the demo, can hear it in appropriate context, what it might sound like live, what it might sound like in a club. You want to put your best foot forward and at least give the track a little bit of loudness, because people are accustomed to hearing electronic music with a little bit of gain to it, a little bit of loudness. And so it's going to sound more close to commercial tracks when you do have a little bit of limiting on your master, even at the demo stage. So with all of that said, let's jump into FL. Let's listen to some audio examples, and yeah, let's get started.
All right, we're here in FL Studio. I have pulled in a pre-master of one of my tracks. Pretty dynamic mix, also pretty loud. You see here the section of the track, the second section of this drop, is competing to be one of the loudest portions of the track. But you'll see a lot of peaks. The limiter has a lot to grab onto, and we'll really be able to hear what the limiter is doing. Here on master chain, just have an inflator and a compressor, just doing a little bit of dynamics and loudness work. Nothing to color the track, nothing to saturate the track or anything like that. No EQs, just loudness tools. And the last thing that should go on your master channel, we'll actually put it down here in slot 10, because anything you put on, the limiter should be last. Any processing that you put on after a limiter is going to create clipping in your track. So always have your limiter as the last tool on your mastering chain to make sure that no audio goes above this threshold, and that is the last line of defense on what your audio is. Okay, so I pulled up L2. Every limiter essentially works the same way. Some have different features than others, but essentially a limiter always does the same job, and that's preventing audio from going above the set threshold. So in the threshold in L2 is actually set with your output here. Okay, and that's essentially the point at which it doesn't allow audio to go above it. The first thing we're going to do when we open a limiter is we're actually going to set our output not at 0, but at negative 0.3, not 0.03, 0.3. And that's because when you export in a lossless format like WAV, AIFF, essentially whatever the output is, if we just leave this at 0, the file in a lossless format like WAV is actually going to be going up to 0. Okay, it won't go above this output. When those lossless files get converted down or compressed down as an MP3 or other lossy, what we call lossy formats, it does create more gain. That compression process will end up pushing the audio above what the actual output is in a lossless format. And in the case of wave to MP3, that tends to be a little bit under about 0.3 dB. So if we were just to leave this at 0, our wave file would not be clipping above 0, but our MP3 file would be going above 0 and clipping, and we don't want it to do that. So let's just create a safe buffer zone for our MP3 files, or whatever type of file our master might be converted into that we don't have control over, by making sure that it's never going to go above 0 by creating that buffer space for us to compensate for those lossless or for those lossy types of conversions into MP3 and things like that. So that's where we're going to set our output at -0.3. And the next thing we're going to do is push a lot of gain into the limiter. Okay, let me actually put this in. Now, Pro-L 2 has these different views that you can use. When mastering, I like to use the loudness view. That's your most zoomed out. It shows you what loudness you're reaching. And then we can zoom in, get higher resolution by going into these other modes that show us more in a detailed view. But let's start with loudness, okay? We're zoomed out quite far. I think it's -64 dB that it shows. So we have a macro picture here. And let's just push a lot of gain into the limiter. The reason for that is with any type of compression or dynamics processing, a great thing to do is to overdo it to really hear the effect of whatever the dynamics processing is, and then pull back from there. So start extreme and then pull your settings back so you can hear exactly how your audio is being shaped by these dynamics tools. Same thing goes to the limiter. We're going to push a lot of gain into this. We're going to get a lot of gain reduction, about 10, maybe even up to 12. We're going to really hear the work that the limiter is doing. We're going to hear some distortion. You're going to hear it distorting when I begin to push it in. What I'm trying to do is to really just hear very obviously and evidently the work this tool is doing. So let me push this gain up. Watch your levels on your end because it's going to get louder as I push this gain up. So be mindful of that. All right, so you can see we are around -12 gain reduction, 10 to 12. The highest it went up to was -12 here. So the compressors or the limiter is really doing a lot of work now. We're going to be able to hear whatever we adjust. We're going to be able to hear it more obviously than we otherwise would have. We can really make decisions that are informed here. So let's just jump through all the processing one by one. Essentially just the attack and release is what we're going to focus on. That is the main parameters that we can control in a limiter like this. So jumping through the advanced tab here within L2, essentially first we have a look ahead and a style. I'm going to go through style later on. Look ahead is not something that I typically adjust. The faster your look ahead, I've just pulled up the tooltip here with my mouse. The faster your look ahead, the louder your mix can be. It does create a bit more distortion when you have faster look ahead times. But for electronic music, we are going for loud mixes. I tend to leave it short. I think there's been very few or maybe no occasions that I've had the need to adjust this. And for electronic styles, we should be fine with a short look ahead. So let's jump into attack and release. Let's start with attack, okay? And just like we were saying how we want to do something that's kind of extreme and then pull back, we're going to start with a very slow attack. We're going to leave our release slow as well. And what we're essentially going to do is pull down the attack, make it faster and faster so that the limiter is doing more work. The faster the attack is, the faster and more work the limiter is doing. It grabs onto the peaks faster. It's having to work harder because it's reacting faster. We're going to hear the effect of the limiter more and more the faster the attack is. And in the case of attack on a limiter or any sort of compressor, what you're going to hear as we pull it down is the dynamics of the track of this, in the master in this case, being controlled a lot. We're actually going to hear a lot of the peaks being kind of the life being sucked out of the mix. Things are going to sound very flat, not dynamic, because all of the transients are just being killed by this limiter very, very quickly without letting things really approach the threshold as quickly. It really softens everything up. We don't want to go too extreme. We want to leave some dynamics in. So I'm going to start slow, pull down until I hear the dynamics being killed, then I'll pull back from that point. Let's do that together. I hope you can hear that. As I pull the attack back, you can hear the track sort of comes to life. You can hear all of the dynamics. You can hear all of the transients. As I pull it down, the track, it sounds like it's getting quieter. And that's because a lot of the dynamics are being sucked out. It really has less energy, right? It's just kind of like a brick wall type of deal. And so the track seems to lose a lot of life and some loudness. So let's, you know, now that you can hear the effect, let's actually find the sweet spot here. And by the way, you can really hear that distortion when I press play. That's on purpose right now. We're of course going to dial that back. We're overdoing it on purpose right now. So I actually like it relatively slow. You know, as I pull it down to around this 9 o'clock region and more, I can really hear some of the transients, especially on the snare, starting to lose a lot of life. I like it around right here. That seems to be a good spot. I don't want to go too open because I do want the limiter to do some work. Again, we are trying to make sure that the track is reined in, that we're not, you know, crunching up on this threshold. If I leave it too open, we're going to get more distortion because it's going to have to work really hard too late. It's going to work really hard when it reaches the absolute threshold. We do want to give ourselves some wiggle room here, make sure the limiter is doing a little bit of early work. So let's put it right in this sweet spot where we're getting some dynamics, but we're not leaving it all the way open. So now we're going to move on to the release, and essentially it's the same task here. We're going to start slow all the way up here, and we're going to pull it down. And in this case, it's kind of the opposite reaction. So as we pull the release down, the track is going to actually be more dynamic, but it's going to start to be, you might hear a little bit of distortion, maybe. Because the point is that as we pull the release down and the audio of the track is being let go by the limiter, and it's being allowed to go really close, jumping back up to this threshold at -0.3, which again, when that audio hits that threshold uncontrolled by the attack and the release, that's when more distortion gets introduced because the limiter is forced to work very, very hard when it reaches that threshold. So by, you know, increasing the release, the limiter does a bit of early work, but you know, and so it's almost like it smooths the response of the limiter out, as opposed to just letting the audio slam back up to the threshold and causing it to work. It smooths out the response. The faster the release is, or the slower the release is, the more dynamics we'll get, but possibly again more distortion. So, you know, it's kind of the reverse of what we're listening to the attack. Same process though. Let's hear where we're at here. Quite frankly, kind of lost control of my release knob there, but quite frankly, as I turn this knob, I'm not hearing a whole lot of difference. That tells me I probably can afford to leave the release relatively short. Now again, I'm pretty weary of going all the way max on limiter settings. We do want the limiter to do some work, but I'm not hearing a whole lot of difference, and so I'm willing to go faster and leave those dynamics in there because we don't need I'm not hearing any additional distortion. I'm not hearing anything ugly as a result of making it faster, so we can afford to do so. One thing I do want to point out within L2 is that it does have this cool feature called Delta, where you can audition, or I guess they call it audition limiting. You can hear only the gain reduction or the work that the limiter is doing, and you can really pinpoint whether or not distortion is being caused by the gain reduction. You're going to be able to hear the distortion very, very clearly if there is any. Let's turn this on and do the same task with the release. listening to only the gain reduction or the work that the limiter is doing. So again, I'm not hearing a whole lot of difference even in audition mode. You know, this clearly this release is not having a big effect on the behavior or the results that we're getting out of this limiter. What I am hearing is that when I push the release very, very slow, I'm just hearing more of the track in general. I'm just hearing the music in a pretty blanket way. That means that as I open this release up, the gain reduction is just kind of being applied on a blanket basis. As I pull this release down, I hear a bit more pumping. I hear more of the transients and less of the rest of the track. That means that the compressor, or the limiter in this case, is letting go and reacting a little faster. So in this case, you know, because we have a relatively slow attack and a relatively fast release, the attack's not too slow, but it's not very fast either. We're retaining a lot of the dynamics of this track. We're not asking the limiter to kill the dynamics, which is ultimately a good thing, but we're still not letting the audio go above our threshold of 0.3 dB. And that really is the goal of what we want to do with limiting, is retain the dynamics to the maximum extent possible without getting a lot of distortion, right? Typically, if we really have a dynamic mix and we push it through a limiter and we leave the dynamics, the more dynamics you leave while still asking the limiter to do the work it does, you're going to get more distortion. In this case, I'm not hearing the distortion. So, you know, we can afford to leave these dynamics by using this attack and release and still achieve the limiting effect of not letting our audio go above the threshold. So I just want to make a note of some of the more advanced aspects of L2. True peak limiting, this button here, this essentially means that between samples or very small bits of time in the audio, what we call intersample pieces of audio, that even those are not going to go above 0. So it actually makes this threshold a complete brick wall. Some limiters on the market don't have a true peak or a brick wall type setting. And even though the threshold is set at a certain point, it actually does allow some bits of audio through. And so you're not getting a real true threshold. Thankfully, the L2 does have a peak limiting mode. It's really useful to make sure that no audio is allowed above the threshold. And oversampling works in conjunction with that. If I pull up the tooltip here, it says, oversampling reduces the amount of aliasing and intersample peaks introduced by the limiting process. So essentially, increasing the oversampling essentially means you're going to get less clipping, less intersample peaking above your threshold, and essentially you're going to get less digital clipping and less distortion, which is a good thing. So really, I mean, in practical terms, just go as high as you're able to go with your CPU still being able to play back the track. You'll see if I go to 32 here, my CPU usage jumps up to 25 or 26 without doing anything. If I turn it off, we're going to go back to about 5 or so. So just go as high as you're able to while still being able to play back the track, and you're going to get the best results possible. The last thing I'll mention is that L2 does allow you to select these other modes. These are algorithms. This is bits of behavior, how the compressor reacts, right? If you go into the help topics and you select advanced settings, you can read a summary of these different algorithms within L2. Most limiters don't have these different algorithms. Most limiters just have the one that's built in with them, and that's what you get. To keep it simple here in this video, I'll let you know that I almost always either use modern or transparent. Modern's the default in Pro-L2. Transparent was the default in Pro-L1. These other modes have their uses. Most of the time, I am just going for what they say for modern, which is it can achieve very high loudness and allows for near zero look-ahead settings while still sounding extremely clean and natural. There's not a whole lot that can be better than that. Obviously, audition through them when you're doing your own limiting, when you're doing your own mastering. See what sounds best in your mix. I almost always go with modern or transparent. So our last step is just to pull back on this gain reduction. We're going to make sure that, right now we're overdoing things, right? We're super loud. We're getting a lot of gain reduction. What we want is really to land between 3 and 5. That's about the max that is going to give you a good, healthy amount of loudness without adding a lot of distortion through the limiting process. So let's aim for that, right under the -5 point on our gain reduction here. So you'll see I'm hitting on an average of around -4, not really hitting above -5 too often. I like where that's at. You'll see I'm pushing 6 decibels of gain, and I'm getting about, right under -5 decibels of gain reduction, which is, again, a healthy point. That tends to be a point that doesn't result in too much distortion. What we can do now is we can close this tab, and I'm just going to zoom in to higher resolutions, 32 and -16, so that we can see the details of how the limiter is behaving a little bit more. So let's go ahead and do that. Here's -32. Check out this higher resolution view here. So you'll see I'm hanging out right around -5. You can see how it's reacting to the peaks there. Let's go into the highest resolution that we have. Oh, not this one. Here we go, -16. So we're zoomed in even more. So we're only seeing -16 scale here on our limiter. You can really see a high resolution of how it's behaving. Let's take a look here. I think we can probably afford to pull back a little bit. Let's go to -5.6. See, now what I'm seeing here is it's flashing mostly in between 3 and 4 with the occasional peak up to about -5. That's what I like to see. So I like where we're at here. We could push higher so long as we're not hearing any distortion, but we don't really need to. I think this is appropriately loud. The last thing to keep an eye out for is L2 creates this line. And that line shows you the RMS of your track, where it's kind of lingering. In trance and progressive, based on what I see in reference tracks, especially for big labels like Anjuna beats, typically a little bit more than -8 is where a lot of tracks are sitting, sometimes a little bit louder. What you want to do is just pull in reference tracks, see how loud they are, not using a limiter per se, but using a loudness meter, seeing what the RMS on those, and then using L2 to achieve, or any other limiter to achieve that same sort of RMS. Let's see where we're at here in this track today. Yeah, so you'll see I'm hanging out just above -8, maybe around -7 or so. That's a pretty good amount of loudness. Again, I think we could probably afford to push louder without any real audible distortion, but I don't feel a need to do that. I think the track sounds nice and loud and full. No distortion coming off this limiter that I can hear, and we're above -8, so I'm comfortable with this. I think we're going to get good results if we went ahead and exported this master right now.
All right, so as always, I hope you learned something from this video that you didn't know before. I hope you got a thing or two from it. Don't be afraid to push some gain onto your demos. Don't be afraid to learn and dive into the mastering process so you can save some money on all those releases and not have to pay someone else every time. But, in any case, you can't avoid the limiting process. I hope you just learned how to move your way around one with this video. Anyway, guys, I'll catch you in the next video. Peace.